Kia ora, and welcome to this Introduction to 3D Modeling course in Blender, courtesy of Oaha Makerspace at Te Kete Aranui Library. My name is Eli Tucker, and I'm a 3D generalist. I work here as a Makerspace librarian, and I'm going to be showing you a few techniques over the next few videos to model some chess pieces in Blender. As for today's video, the objective is to understand the Blender interface and learn some very basic 3D modeling techniques. 3D modeling is all about moving points in space to define a three-dimensional geometry, which could be an object, a shape, or a character. You can use 3D modeling to create anything you can imagine, and it's also a lot of fun. So the way we're going to be going about this is using polygon modeling techniques, including things like Boolean shapes, extrusion, 3D sculpting, and many other techniques we'll learn over the next few videos. Blender is a full 3D production package. It's free and open source, which means that it's available for anyone to use, and there's a great community online that can help you learn to do pretty much anything you'd like to do in Blender. So obviously today we're going to be using Blender to try and create chess pieces, but the same process could be used to do all sorts of different assets for games, animated films, VFX, and rapid prototyping as well. While I'm predominantly a Maya user, I've used Blender professionally on projects such as Power Rangers, and also I've taught it at Victoria University. Okay, here are some useful hotkeys, and you can find a link to this cheat sheet in the description below. Here are some useful hotkeys. You can find a link to this document in the description below. Today we're going to be focusing on the Blender interface and also learning how to navigate around the 3D viewport and some very basic modeling tools. So let's open up Blender and get right into it. When you first open Blender, you'll be greeted with this splash screen, which will show recent projects and everything. You can just click off to the side in the empty space of the 3D viewport to get rid of that. And the first thing I like to do is to delete all of these starter objects. So we can do that by pushing A and then delete on the keyboard. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about this viewport. So we have the 3D viewport here. This is the main screen, which shows you all of your objects in 3D space. We'll talk about navigating this in a second. Over on the right hand side we have the outliner, which is basically just an easy way to access all of the things stored in the scene. If I push Ctrl Z to undo deleting all those objects, you'll see that we have them stored here inside of this collection. But I will push delete and just get rid of those for now. Below the outliner we have the properties panel, and this is responsible for holding all of the different attributes of our objects. So let's have a look at the 3D viewport specifically now. We can navigate around this by using the middle mouse button. So if I click the middle mouse button and drag, you can see that this will allow me to rotate the camera around my 3D view. If I hold Shift and middle mouse click, this allows me to pan the camera. And finally, if I hold Control and middle mouse click, this allows me to zoom the camera in and out. I can also do this by rolling the mouse wheel. Excellent. On top of these camera manipulation tools, we also have the numpad. If I push numpad 1, this will jump me into the front orthographic view. If you don't have a numpad, you can also do this by clicking on this little circle labeled -y. This will also take us to the front orthographic view. I can push numpad 3 or click on the red X over here, and this takes me into the right orthographic view. And another one that's really useful is number 7, which takes us to the top orthographic view. You can also get to this by clicking on the blue Z over here. Alright, holding Control and clicking any of these buttons, so this is numpad 1, that will go to the back orthographic view. Holding Control and pushing numpad 3 goes to the left side. So basically it's just going to give us the opposite of the default behavior. And at any time we can middle mouse click to jump away from those orthographic views back to a perspective view. So it's really useful to get used to moving the camera around the scene. Once we start to model, we're going to want to see our object from multiple sides, And using these orthographic views allows us to simplify the modeling process a lot. Excellent. So let's move on. We're going to look at some really basic modeling tools now. We'll start by just adding a cube to our scene, which is a little bit ironic considering we deleted one right at the beginning. We can do this by hitting Shift A and going to Mesh, Cube. And you can see we've added a cube to our scene. You can also see over here in our outliner, we now have a cube underneath our collection. And in our properties panel, in the objects panel, we have some information about this cube, such as its location and rotation. At the moment, these are all set to the default, but let's go ahead and start to move this around. So if I push G, this is the grab tool, and you can see that as I move my mouse around, the cube is going with it. If I left click, it will drop it wherever it is, and that's moved my cube. You'll also notice that over here, our location variables have changed. So if I want to move that back, I can either push Ctrl Z, or I could also just go ahead and change these numbers to 0. And you can see that's an easy way of moving it back to that starting point. If I want to move my cube just up, I can push G and Z to lock it to the Z axis, which is the up and down axis. And if I want to move it up exactly 2 units, I can push 2 as well. And you'll see if I left click now, over here I've only moved up by 2 units on the Z axis. This works for the X and Y axis as well. So X is this red one and Y is the green one. So G and Y moves just on that green axis. I push escape, I can drop it back where it used to be. G and X allows me to move it on that X axis as well. Very good. I'm going to move my cube back to the center of the scene, and we'll move on to looking at the rotate tool now. So if I push the R key, this allows me to rotate my cube. At the moment, I'm just rotating it arbitrarily based on the camera. So because I'm looking at it from this angle, it's rotating based on that camera angle. If I rotate it to something like this, you'll see that it rotates that way instead. And if I jump into an orthographic view, it will rotate perfectly around that orthographic angle. I can also rotate it on specific axes, similar to how I moved my cube only up by 2 units before. I can push R, and I could push something like Z, so it's only rotating around that up and down axis, which is the Z axis. And then I could give it a specific amount as well. I could say RZ45, and you can see now it's been rotated exactly 45 degrees on the Z axis. Very good. The final way of manipulating this cube is to push S, which is the scale tool. So I can scale it up and down. I can scale it up and down only on Z by pushing S and then Z, and so on. There's also another way I can do this. I can also push S and then Shift Z, and you can see that scales it on every axis except for Z. So it's keeping the original height, but scaling it in the other 2 axes. Excellent. Now we can also create duplicates of this cube by pushing Shift D, and I can move this around like so. Notice as I'm doing this and just left clicking to drop these, it's adding all of these extra cubes to my outliner under my collection. I can either select them by holding Shift and clicking on them in the viewport, or I can do the same by clicking on them in this outliner as well. Now the last thing I want to mention is this 3D cursor, which you can see right at the center of my scene. At the moment, this is stuck in the center of my scene, but I can actually move this around. If I hold Shift and right click, you can see that will move my 3D cursor wherever I want. If I want to move it back to the center of the scene, I can push Shift S and go to Cursor to World Origin. The 3D cursor is responsible for being a spawning point for all of my objects in my scene. So if I do move this away somewhere, let's say over here, and try and create a new object now, you can see that's where that cube will be spawned, which can be really useful. You can also see that it's taken on the transforms of that 3D cursor when it's been created. I can use selection to cursor to move it to that point as well. Okay, so now that we've looked at all of these ways to manipulate this object in object mode, let's go a little deeper, because currently all of the changes we've been making are only keeping it a cube, and there's not really any modeling involved. Well, I can change the way the shape looks by going into edit mode. You can do that over on the top here. You can see we're currently in object mode. We're going to change to edit mode, and there's a hotkey for that. If we push tab, we can jump between object and edit mode. So now that we're in edit mode, you can see a few things have changed. My object has gone orange, and you can see that we have these little points which we can now select. Now these points are called vertices, and I can manipulate them exactly the same as the way I moved the cube around before. So if I push G, you can see I can move these points around. And if I push G and Z, it'll move it only up and down, and so on. I can even take a selection of points and use the rotate tool. Rotating only on Z, or I could scale them, and so on. So there's a lot you can do here. However, at the moment, no matter what I do, I've still only got these 8 points to play with. And really, that's not enough to make any complex shapes. So, if I want to add more points, an easy way of doing that is to use Ctrl R, which is the Insert, Loop, and Slide tool. You can see that it's creating this yellow line over the edge I'm hovering over. So let's go and click right here, and you can see now I have the ability to slide along this edge. I'm just going to push Escape now, which drops it right in the middle. And I can go ahead and make changes to these points as well. As you can see, it's added new points to allow me to further develop the look of my object. So I'm just going to go ahead and scale some of these points, moving them around like so. Next, let's add a Ctrl R, Insert, Loop, and Slide through this axis. And I'll push Escape once again to drop it there. And you can see slowly creating some sort of more complicated shape. Let's do another one through this axis. Now I've got enough points that I could create something like a top hat. In fact, let's do that. I'm going to select all of the points going around this middle section by holding Alt and clicking, and then I can scale all of these down and move them down. And we've got a stylized top hat. Let's use another loop through here. So Ctrl R, scaling it down a little bit, and rotating it just to get a little bit more character into this. Very good. So far we've only been looking at changing this object using its vertices, but there is the ability to change it on an edge mode or a face mode as well. So let's have a look at these. I can either use these little tools up the top here, or I can push 1, 2, and 3 to cycle between these. 1 is for vertices, 2 is for edges, and as you can see I can select edges on their own, and 3 is for faces. So now that I'm in face mode, I can select entire faces and manipulate those. I'm going to delete this top hat now. Let's do that by jumping back into object mode. To do this, we'll push tab. Now we can just push delete. Next, let's go ahead and model a very simple pawn. To do this activity, we're going to use just cylinders and a sphere, and use some of those editing techniques to make this cylinder slightly curvy. Let's go into a side view. I'm going to push numpad 3. If you don't have a numpad, feel free to just click on the red X to get into this view. Now let's hit Shift A, and we're going to add a mesh UV sphere. I'm going to mouse wheel out to zoom out a little bit, and hold Shift and middle mouse drag to move up slightly. Let's move the sphere up by pushing G and Z. Somewhere around here should be fine. I want it to be a few units above this green line. Now let's hit Shift A, and we're going to add a cylinder. mesh cylinder. I'm going to make it a lot shorter, so I'm going to push SZ and get it nice and flat like this. Next, let's push G and Z to move it up just underneath the sphere. They should be contacting one another slightly like this as well. I'll push Shift and D to create a duplicate. At the moment it's moving freely. Let's push Z to lock it to moving only on the Z axis. I'm going to move it down so it's just touching this green line down here. Now let's scale this up, but only on all of the axes besides the Z axis. To do that, we're going to push S, Shift Z, and create a nice, give it a nice radius for the base of this pawn. Something like this. I'm going to create one more. Shift D and push Z to move it only upwards. And once again, let's push S, Shift Z, and just bring it in a little. Something like this. All right. So these are going to be kind of like my different tiers of this pawn. And in between them, I'd like to create something that looks nice and flowy, a nice curvy shape to bridge them. So let's just duplicate one more of these, Shift D, and I'm going to place it right in the middle like this and scale it nice and tall. So SZ to scale it, and something like this should be fine. Going to move it up just slightly so it's within the bounds of this sphere, this cylinder here, and the cylinder at the top. Excellent. Let's jump into our edit mode now by pushing Tab. I'm going to push 1 to go into vertex mode and select all of the vertices at the top. Now, as you can see, if I try and move these now, something strange is happening. You can see it left behind all of the vertices at the top that were behind my selection. Let's undo, Control Z. Now, there's an easy way of getting around this. If I push Alt Z, this will drop me into X-ray mode. You can also toggle it here. With X-ray mode active, I can now select all of these vertices and scale them down, just like so. Let's scale the ones at the bottom up a little bit as well. S to scale. Now, this looks alright, but at the moment, this shape is kind of just straight up and down. I'd like it to flow a little bit more. To do this, we're going to add some loop and slide using Control R. Let's click here and drop it somewhere like here. I can scale it up a little, and we can add another one down here. Scale this up a bit, adding one in the middle, or maybe scale that down. And you can see how quickly we're able to make large changes to the shape of this pawn. At any point, I can come back in and select these, push G to move them around. I can push Z to lock them to that Z axis, and once again scale them and just create the shape I'm after. And there we have it. We have a very simple 3D chess pawn modeled in Blender.